My question would be political influence, because we see the Western medias are continuously defaming the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. On the other side, Russian belt medias are continuously criticizing the role of Western leaders, including US President Donald Trump. Sir, my question is about the political influence. Do you think political agendas influence media coverage more today than in the past? How can journalists maintain independence in such an environment, such a situation, sir?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Again, this is a question that goes straight to the heart of the problems that journalism is grappling with these days, and it has to do again. The picture is very complex. I think the short answer to your question is definitely there is more polarization, and I think the more biased information, various narratives flying out there, and of course that is even more complicated, as I discussed before, by the fact that there are various types of narratives. It's not only journalistic content that people are accessing and are faced with, but how when we talk about how journalists can protect their independence, that has to do, and let me refer here to one major aspect. It has to do with the sustainability of the media model in today's world. Essentially, what I'm saying here is it really depends, how the independence, the editorial independence, and all kinds of forms of independence for journalists is dependent on who is paying for this content. And today, if we go back to understanding, how various narratives are flying, as I mentioned, through one of our studies, we have noticed that the government has a very strong position here. So you have in the last count, where we mapped 170 countries, we counted more than 7,000 various channels and assets owned by state media across the world, and this is a very large, some of them with very big outreach, some of them having monopoly in their fields and so on. Out of all those, more than only about 15% had independence, and these are usually public service media in some European countries and a couple of countries elsewhere, like in Asia. And so back to your question, I think everything depends on the question of sustainability. To be really independent as a journalist, I think you have to have a source of funding and support that doesn't link you in any way with various players. It doesn't come with any strings attached. I mentioned the role of the government. Essentially, if you think about journalism, journalistic content is paid by probably like three major sources. One is government, and we see the problems there. If you don't have a system that actually insulates you as a journalist from pressures from the government, you have advertisers, private companies that pay for your content. When you have that case, you have more independence, because usually you have, especially in some media outlets that are very strong on the idea of independence, you have a separation there between editorial and marketing, and then you have the public. You have models of media outlets where the public pays you either in the form of subscription or membership or donation. And I think that is the model where journalists are the most independent, because basically they are accountable directly and only to the public. However, that model is very rare, because many people do not realize that if they don't contribute to journalism, what they will get, somebody else will do, and what they will get will be a biased picture. So I think we have a very problematic situation here, where a number of factors are contributing and are continue to fund journalism, and nothing is wrong with that. The problem is to what extent they try to influence the narrative, and I think today we have a much more biased narrative than we had a decade or more ago.
Sir, very fascinating and very logical, very practical, very technical response you have done. I'm really very much impressed, and I'm sure one relevant question has come again on your table regarding the global media trending. From your perspective, how do global media outlets differ in framing international conflicts, war, disaster, accidents, in political issues, and compared to local and regional media as well. One more thing I just want to add, Professor, that is we see the influence of the social media, especially X handle, I mean former Twitter, especially the Facebook, YouTube and other social medias. Do you think media should have its own editorial strong policy to serve the audience, to serve the public, to serve the viewers, sir?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think earlier on we spoke about, the issue of bias and independence. I think when it comes and the issue of what, who's crafting the content going out there. And I think the editorial work is the most important factor there, because on the one hand, if you have content coming from a journalistic source that respects itself and that has editors and journalists double checking the information and everything else before they broadcast it or publish it, then obviously you have more quality and more truthful information. On the other hand, everyone essentially is able to actually share any type of content, and they don't have that stage. They don't have that step. They don't check anything usually. They don't have to, maybe some of them do it, but they don't have an editorial process. Well, that editorial process costs money, and I think you know better than me. That's actually, what journalists are paid for, to actually check the information that is going out to people. Now back to part of your question about how global media are covering various issues. In fact, I can give you a very specific example, because we just finalized the study that mapped through which we monitor content specifically about coverage of a humanitarian crisis. The project actually is called Humanitarian Crisis Coverage Report, which is due to be launched in September. And essentially what we have done, we mapped the 10 largest conflicts in the world, including Gaza, Ukraine, Chad, Ethiopia and others, and we tried to see how a number of media outlets, and we included over 20 media outlets, both from the US, UK, global media, but also included, for example, Russia Today and Al Jazeera, and trying to understand how they cover these topics and this crisis. Of course, there are many things. Just to stay within your question, I think what we have noticed definitely is that the coverage is uneven. On the one hand, you have massive coverage for Gaza and Ukraine. On the other hand, you have very little. Sometimes, some of the conflicts in Africa, for example, are not even given even less than 1% of the total coverage. So there is a huge discrepancy there, and the picture is very uneven. To a certain extent, I understand that, because if you depending on your audience, you have to respond to what people want to learn about, and you talk in this program about some geopolitical developments that are very important for some of the media and the audiences they serve. However, there is still a problem there, because I think there is an issue with the coverage, and what we have noticed is what we call hierarchy of coverage. And on the one hand, we saw that there is definitely global media tends to be very much interested in covering to a very large extent issues and topics and conflicts that have geopolitical resonance and that are very close to the interests of the Western allies. And on the other hand, the global South is almost inexistent in this coverage. And the third point that I wanted to make, and I think it links to some of the issues that we discuss here, is that we have also noticed some trends related to them, to how coverage actually links with media ownership patterns and geopolitical alignment. For example, we saw that outlets such as the public service broadcaster in Britain, BBC, or a media outlet that is privately owned, like the New York Times, tend to have a more perceived balance in their coverage, while on the other hand, media outlets like RT, media outlets that are state-owned, for example, tend to reflect more the respective government's foreign policy agendas. So in many respects, of course, we expect that, but I think these editorial differences influence to a large degree which crises are covered, how they are framed, and whom audiences are encouraged to actually. And of course, as I said, there are many things there, but what I just described to you, these are findings that we are still working on, and again, they will be public soon. I think this shows, on the one hand, a very uneven picture when it comes to how media outlets are reflecting the major problems and geopolitical developments we are facing today.
It is my personal curiosity, since I have been into this business more than 2 decades. My question would be, sir, ethics in journalism. What are the biggest ethical challenges facing modern journalists when reporting on sensitive political issues, and how can they balance speed with accuracy? And one more question I want to add, because this will be your last question as you have the time limitations, sir. Future of media. Looking ahead, how do you see the role of traditional media changing in the face of citizen journalism, artificial intelligence driven news, and increasing audience polarization, sir?
Yeah, thank you very much for, again, this very thoughtful question. Starting with the ethical one, ethics in journalism, I think obviously you have on the one hand some older issues, ethics related issues that journalism is facing, and that has to do how sources are used, what how various connections between journalists and the sources are cultivated. But on the other hand, you are totally right. I think the need for speed and the current patterns in media and communication are forcing to very often journalists to actually act more on speed than on accuracy, and that has a lot of repercussions. It's hard to list here all the issues that we see, but as I just mentioned, I think some of the old problems, such as how to use sources, are becoming more complex today because journalists have access to a lot of people online on social media, and you have many questions there. How are you using these people? How do you trust them as a source? How often you are using? You have then the problem of connections and political connections. We spoke about that. I think it's really important when you have a certain type of ownership to actually build a wall between editorial and the interests of the owners. You have the problem of polarization that is coming from this very politically charged communication system, where journalists sometimes they cannot actually put their political bias in the stories, and this is something wrong. And this is a very old, precept and story about journalism, how you separate opinion from facts. And unfortunately, we have a lot of that problem in many narratives that we see today. So you have a lot of that. And finally, I would say the accountability is and how journalists, to whom they are accountable, and how they treat the people that are affected by their stories, especially vulnerable people.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Always
sir.
in a journalism. On the other hand, where journalism is going, I think you're right. The AI is massively changing the game here. We notice we are not a journalistic outlet. We are a research center of studying journalism, but we already feel AI is changing dramatically the rules of the game, the way people engage with content and produce content. On the other hand, I think some of the trends that I notice, and I dare to look a bit into the future. I think we are
absolutely correct, sir. Absolutely correct, sir. Professor Marius Dragomin, it's very fascinating response from your side.